It was sudden.
Where's Dad right now?
A sudden message from my oldest son, who lives overseas. He's in Seattle on a business assignment by himself. Why? I answered, feeling puzzled. My husband had been working in Seattle alone for 3 years. Ken should know that. There must be a good reason for him to ask where is he now, so directly. When I heard that reason, I felt anger start bubbling up inside me. I am Julie Miller, a 55-year-old stay-at-home mom. My husband, Charles, is 58, 3 years older than me. He's currently working in Seattle on a solo assignment. Our oldest son, Ken, got married 5 years ago and moved out, living on his own now. For the past 3 years, I've been living alone in our big house out in the countryside. Charles works in construction, and he's been traveling a lot for business ever since he was young. There are certain job sites that apparently can't move forward without him, so he's often away for long periods of time. 3 years ago, he finally relocated to Seattle for a solo assignment. I was worried about him living alone, considering his age, but it seems like he can handle everything just fine, and he doesn't seem to have any trouble. Sometimes I think about visiting him, but I've always had terrible motion sickness. Everyone tells me that taking motion sickness medicine would help, but that kind of stuff doesn't work on me. I still remember how awful it was when I had to call an ambulance every time I traveled far. I still feel bad about not being able to take Ken on trips when he was little. Because of that, I've never visited Charles at his work assignment. If there's ever an issue, I figure he'll call me. That's the kind of mindset I've had, day after day. Even though I live a fulfilling life without him around. It's not like I don't get lonely. In the first year of his solo assignment, Charles called me nearly every day. He was worried about leaving me alone, constantly reminding me to lock the doors properly and be careful about fire hazards. There were times when I got a little tired of it. But by the 3rd year, his calls became almost non-existent. Sometimes, even when I call him, he doesn't respond. The living expenses are still being transferred to me, so there's really nothing to worry about, but sometimes, as a wife, I just want to hear his voice. Whenever we do talk on the phone, the conversation always ends up on the topic of when he's coming home from Seattle, but Charles only gives vague answers. I'd like to talk to Ken about it, but he and his wife live overseas, and it's hard to coordinate a time to call. Besides, it would be awkward for me, as an older mother, to complain about being lonely without their father over an international call. At night, I checked my phone for missed calls, but there was no call from Charles today either. I decided to call him this time and selected his number. It was just before 8 p.m., still too early to go to bed. I let it ring, but he didn't answer. After 12 rings, I hung up. He didn't call back that night, and the morning came. There should be a missed call from me on his phone. If he was busy and couldn't answer, he could have called back after some time. I felt a little sad. I had no choice but to tell myself he must be busy with work. Since Charles moved to Seattle, I've been spending more time working in the garden. Little by little, I've been turning our large country garden into the English garden I always dreamed of. At first, I had no idea where to start, so I began gathering information online and at the library. Before I knew it, I'd become a regular at the gardening supply store. Through gardening, I started to expand my circle of acquaintances bit by bit. Every time I made a new friend, they'd ask, "How's your husband?" When I'd say that he was away on assignment, they'd all say, "Oh, that must be nice." They envied me for not having to take care of a husband. I once told Charles about it over the phone.
Oh, so you're just playing in the dirt without working, huh? Must be nice and easy for you. Here I am, working by myself in Seattle.
I meant it as a funny little story, but Charles's reaction caught me off guard. He got angry, saying that I was wasting the money he earned. In the end, he even called me a parasite and hung up on me. I was deeply hurt by his words. When we first got married, I wanted to keep working, but it was Charles who asked me to stay at home. Back in those early days, he'd say things like, "As long as you take care of the house, that's enough for me." Where did that kind and understanding Charles go? The day after he yelled at me, I immediately went looking for a part-time job. But it wasn't easy to find something suitable. I felt frustrated to continue being called a parasite by Charles, so I searched desperately for work. And then, a turning point came for me. That day, I was out in the garden, taking care of the planters. I arranged some seasonal flowers in a planter and placed it near the entrance. This time, I made 2 rectangular planters near the gate. Seeing this, a neighbor asked me to make an arrangement for her. She offered to pay for the materials and my fee, asking me to make a seasonal flower arrangement. I was surprised at the unexpected request, but I happily accepted. I visited her front door to get a feel for the kind of arrangement she wanted. She said she dreamed of a white garden, so I created a subtle and refreshing arrangement with soft colors. I think it turned out beautifully, even by my standards. I can still remember the look on her face when I delivered it. At first, she looked surprised. Next, she let out an exclamation and gave me a big smile. The payment I received was more than I expected, and I felt a bit overwhelmed. After that, similar requests started coming my way. At first, I thought of it as just a small side job. 2 years later, I'm now handling requests like it's a full-time job. I started earning enough to put all the money Charles sent me into savings and still get by. I thought earning enough to no longer be considered a dependent might be an issue, so I had to hold back on the work. I'm definitely not a parasite to Charles. It was around this time that I finally started to gain confidence in myself. Of course, I told Charles about my work because I was so happy about it. I fully believed he'd be happy for me too. But that expectation was quickly shattered.
Huh? You're charging money for some play pretend kind of thing like that. Isn't that basically a scam?
Charles laughed and ridiculed my work. He even called it child's play and a scam. I felt tears welling up out of frustration. Sure, maybe it looked that way to Charles. But I was giving it my all, doing it seriously. I couldn't believe he'd laugh at something someone was working so hard at. "What's gotten into you? You didn't used to be this sarcastic," I blurted out without thinking. I think that was the first time since we got married that I'd ever said anything critical of Charles.
Maybe I'm finally free to say what I've been holding back now that I'm over here.
And with that, he hung up again. I remember that night well, the frustration and sadness that made my tears unstoppable. This is how a rift slowly began to form between us. But I believed that once his assignment ended and we were living together again, everything would be fine. I thought Charles would surely compliment the garden when he saw it too. Thinking of his return from Seattle, I decided to create a garden where the 2 of us could relax together. Then one day, I received an unexpected call from Ken. It was an international call to the landline. "Oh, Ken. It's been a while. How is everyone? When are you coming home next?" I was so happy to hear from Ken that I bombarded him with questions.
Mom, that's not why I'm calling.
Ken, on the other end of the line, interrupted my questions in a rather hurried tone. I was surprised by Ken's unusual attitude since he usually listens to me patiently. Maybe something serious happened over there. My heart started pounding. "What's wrong, Ken? Did something happen? Is it bad news?" My voice trembled with tension. I could hear Ken take a deep breath on the other end. He was trying hard to calm himself too.
Where's Dad right now?
He asked in a very serious voice. "He's in Seattle on a solo assignment." Feeling tense, I couldn't help but feel a little let down by Ken's question. I thought it was something more serious. Why would he ask something so obvious? Ken knew about the solo assignment. Hearing my response, Ken let out another long sigh. Then, he told me hesitantly,
Mom, that's a lie.
"Huh?" All I could do was ask him to repeat himself. I couldn't understand what Ken was trying to say. Seeing my confusion, Ken began to explain slowly. Ken said that he and his family were currently in Bali. They were enjoying their vacation there. It seemed he had spotted Charles. At first, he thought it was just someone who looked like him, so he didn't pay much attention. But then he passed by the same street again another day. No matter how many times he saw him, it looked exactly like his father.
I followed him. Then I saw Dad living with a young woman. It didn't look like they were just there on a trip. It seemed like they were living together.
Ken's words gave me a shock like I'd never experienced before. Charles would never do such a thing. I wanted to say that, but the words got stuck in my throat.
Mom, has Dad been sending you the living expenses?
Those words startled me. Since I'd been making my own money lately, I hadn't checked the account where Charles sent the money. I had been saving it without spending any, thinking we could use it for a trip or some home renovations when he came back. I quickly ended the call with Ken and rushed to look up my bank account, which I hadn't logged in over a year. There had been no transactions to record. Nervously, I checked the transaction history and discovered that there had been no deposits for nearly a year and a half. I felt like I was about to collapse. I never imagined something like this could happen to me. I immediately contacted Ken and told him that the living expenses hadn't been deposited. Ken muttered, "I knew it." He said he would return home right away and hung up. Despite feeling dizzy, I followed Ken's instructions. First, I contacted Charles's company. And then, a shocking truth came to light. Apparently, Charles had taken early retirement. It had been about a year and a half ago. The HR representative said, "Ma'am, could it be that you didn't know?" I honestly replied that I had no idea. It seemed that Charles's situation had been a topic of gossip within the company. The first year, it was true that he went to Seattle for his assignment. But apparently, Charles got involved with a younger woman he met there. It was rumored within the company that she had pushed him to take early retirement. I thanked the representative for telling me the truth and ended the call. As soon as I hung up, I felt anger toward him bubbling up inside me. He must have used his retirement money to go overseas. Maybe he planned to live there until the money ran out. Now I understood why he had been so cold to me. The woman he was with was apparently still in her 30s. I made a firm decision and headed to the county office. "Hi, it's been a while. I was worried since you never answered my calls." Using Ken's phone, I called Charles, and he answered without hesitation. Pretending I didn't know anything, I greeted him as usual. He seemed a little surprised that it was me on the other end of the line.
Oh, I've just been busy with work. Sorry about the living expenses. I figured it'd be fine if I was late since I heard you were making money too. And then I guess I just forgot to send it for a while.
I almost laughed at the unconvincing excuse. Ken and his wife, who had returned home, were quietly listening to our conversation. "That's okay. I'm getting by on my own earnings. But I'd still appreciate it if you'd send it. Oh, and I have some good news for you. I've overcome my motion sickness." I intentionally used a cheerful tone to report it. "Now I can come see you in Seattle. You'll show me around, won't you?" I could sense Charles getting flustered on the other end. He probably never imagined that I'd overcome my motion sickness. Of course, it was a lie. There was no way I had overcome it. Anyone who thought about it for a moment would know that overcoming that was nearly impossible, but he was too nervous to think straight because he had something to hide.
Oh, really? You don't get motion sickness anymore? That's great. You've made progress. but I've been so busy with work. Even if you come to Seattle, I don't think I'd have time for you.
Ken, his wife, and I exchanged glances, expecting this kind of excuse. It was exactly what we thought he'd say, and it was so ridiculous that it made us want to laugh. That's okay. Ken and his family said they'd come with me. It's been a while since they've been back, and it'd be nice to have a family reunion in Seattle, don't you think? Charles kept insisting that he was too busy with work. I kept pressing him, tightening the screws like a noose around his neck. Oh, if you're that busy, I guess it can't be helped. That's too bad. Since Ken's here, maybe we'll just take a trip abroad instead. I saw a TV special about Indonesia the other day. Bali looks so lovely. When I mentioned Bali, I definitely heard Charles gasp. Good. Let him be crushed by the fear of having his lies exposed. After putting enough pressure on him, I hung up, satisfied. Charles was probably relieved when the call ended.
Mom, are you really okay?
Ken looked into my face worriedly. I was already feeling a cold sweat even before getting on the plane. Ken's wife, Rachel, held my hand.
It'll be fine. I'm here with you.
She encouraged me. I had taken medication for motion sickness, and I had managed the flight here without issue. I kept telling myself that I'd be fine. For this day, I had been going to the ENT clinic, trying to reduce my motion sickness as much as possible. By the time I got my passport, I was able to ride the bus, and I even overcame taking the train. Holding on tightly to the prescribed motion sickness medication, I was now about to board an international flight. The thought of seeing Charles panic gave me the strength to get through it. Let's go. I'm okay, I said, smiling at Rachel. The medication from the hospital must have been effective, as I slept deeply on the plane. Even during the layover, I was half asleep. And now, here I was, standing in front of the condominium where Charles and the woman were living. After taking a deep breath, I exchanged glances with Ken and his wife, and then pressed the doorbell. The one who answered the door was a young woman. I had heard she was in her 30s, but she looked like she was still in her early 30s. Before she could say anything, I introduced myself as Charles's wife. Her face turned visibly pale almost immediately. With a scream-like cry, she ran inside, deeper into the house. It didn't take long for Charles to appear. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. I got over my motion sickness, so I came to see you. Seattle is really far, isn't it? I barely hear any English here. What an assignment location this turned out to be. I said this with a smile. Charles's face also quickly turned pale.
Julie, you've got it all wrong. This is a vacation. Yes, a company trip. There's nothing shady going on.
Even at this point, he continued to make weak excuses, and I was just exasperated. Ken looked at his father, now full of contempt for his pathetic behavior. I told Charles everything. I'd already contacted his company and confirmed that he had retired, and I also knew that he had been involved with the woman since his assignment in Seattle. With that, I handed Charles the divorce papers. I came today to deliver this. Or rather, could you sign it? We can't move forward without a divorce. This ridiculous situation has to end. I think I was smiling, but my eyes were definitely not. I glared at Charles the entire time. He looked at me like he was scared. Fill it out right now. I want to get this over with quickly. I'll leave the rest to the lawyer. Oh, and of course, I'll be demanding alimony. After all, you're the one at fault in this divorce. Charles reacted when I mentioned alimony.
Wait, I understand about the divorce. I know it's inevitable, but please, spare me the alimony. I've already retired.
Don't be ridiculous. You've got your retirement pay, don't you? You think the divorce is inevitable? Of course, it's convenient for you. Don't mock me. Perhaps resigned to my angry outburst, Charles obediently signed the divorce papers. I took the completed papers, carefully placing them in my bag. Then I spoke to the mistress who was trembling behind Charles. Once the divorce is finalized, this fool will be all yours, both in name and reality. But as for the retirement money you were after, I'll be taking it. Too bad for you. I'd heard from rumors that this woman, whom he'd met while out drinking, was only after Charles's money. She had apparently urged him to retire just to get her hands on his retirement pay. That money would now be taken by me as alimony. How she'd manage with the leftover husk of a man was her problem. Seeing the stunned look on her face brought me a sense of satisfaction.
From the moment I first saw Dad, I wished more than anything that it was just my mistake, that I was seeing things. I never imagined Dad would betray you, Mom. Now he has to clean up his own mess.
Ken, who had been silently listening to the exchange between Charles and me, finally spoke up, as if this was the last thing he had to say. This seemed to affect Charles as well. It must be hard for him to be despised by his own son.
Ken, one day you'll understand. You're a man too. So please, don't look at me like that.
Charles pleaded as if he were shouting, but Ken looked down at him with a cold gaze. I wanted to get out of this place as soon as possible. I gave Charles my final ultimatum. Anyway, just pay the alimony. That's all I have left to say. Charles clasped his hands together and begged me. There wasn't even an ounce of dignity left in him as a father.
I'm sorry. I'll apologize, so please spare me the alimony.
This isn't something you can just apologize for. It's about how I feel. I turned my back on Charles, who kept repeating his apologies. That was the final farewell between Charles and me. Afterward, I stayed a little longer with Ken and Rachel, enjoying the sights in Bali and Jakarta. I thought I'd never get on an international flight again after that. The old me would have been shocked to see this version of myself. I used to think I'd never travel abroad in my life. Upon returning home, I submitted the divorce papers at the city hall. Officially, Charles and I were now strangers. Ken didn't oppose our divorce at all, and he declared his full support for me. I claimed alimony from Charles through a lawyer that a friend had introduced to me. I had a rough idea of the amount of his retirement pay, and I never intended to take all of it. However, it turned out that there was less left than I had expected. The lawyer informed me that Charles had contacted them, saying he couldn't pay it all in a lump sum. When the investigation confirmed that he genuinely didn't have the means to pay, I was left speechless. How much had he spent on that woman? Through the lawyer, I conveyed to Charles that if he couldn't pay the alimony in full, I wanted the family home instead. More than money, I didn't want to let go of the garden I had created. Charles accepted this proposal, and I agreed to reduce the alimony amount accordingly. While I was starting a new life with a sense of freedom, it seemed that Charles had more of a nightmare waiting for him. They say, when the money's gone, the connection ends. As soon as the retirement funds started to dry up, the mistress quickly left him. It seemed she took everything of value with her. One morning, Charles woke up to find everything completely gone. While he was planning to marry her, she was likely looking for the right opportunity to abandon him. In the end, Charles returned to US nearly penniless. Afraid of being the subject of gossip back home, it seemed that he rented a small apartment in Seattle. I heard that he had asked Ken to be the guarantor for the apartment, and Ken reluctantly agreed. Given his age, finding a new job seemed difficult, as Ken told me. Originally, he could have retired with a position and stayed connected with the company. Now, he was likely alone, reflecting on the cost of his mistakes. I heard that he said he wanted to get back together with me, but I'm sorry, that's not happening. I never want to see his face again. Ken asked me how he should respond, and I told him to say it was beyond audacious. Since then, there's been no mention of reconciliation. Charles will likely grow old alone in that small apartment. I divorced Charles, keeping the money, the garden, and the house. Now, I was free to do whatever I wanted with the garden. It was almost finished, the ideal English garden I had dreamed of. To celebrate its completion, I decided to fulfill a long-held dream. I rebuilt the aging family home and opened a small cafe. Enjoying afternoon tea while overlooking an authentic English garden. At first, I was worried whether anyone would come to such a countryside cafe. After being featured in a local magazine and spread on social media, the cafe quickly became bustling with visitors every day. I heard that Ken and his family would be returning from their overseas assignment next year. Rachel said she'd like to help out at the cafe. This new chapter of my life began in this garden. I want to continue protecting this garden with my family in the years to come. How did you enjoy this story? Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.